Welcome to the Coffee with Karim podcast. This is Karim Sirajuddin. In honor of Black History Month, I thought this would be a great time to release this show on Islam in Brazil, or the history of Islam in Brazil. It's not quite North American Black history, but it is South America. And I think what was really great about this conversation is we talked a little bit about just Muslim African history in general. We talked about the transatlantic slave trade. We talked about Mansa Musa, the great king of West Africa, and the possibilities and research around how African Muslims were already crossing over to the Americas before the Portuguese and the Spanish. And of course, we get into specifically the history of Islam in Brazil. So I hope you really enjoy the show and learn something for those of you who enjoy history. And please support this podcast by leaving me a review on iTunes, sponsoring a coffee, or more at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. I love doing this show, and when I get support from the audience, whether it's a review or sponsorship, it really helps me make more time for putting together these amazing conversations. If you become a patron today, you can submit your own questions to some of my future guests, so you don't want to miss out on any of that. Thanks again for your support and tuning in to the Coffee with Karim podcast. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. Today I have Brother Habeeb Akande returning once again for another amazing show. Today we're going to be discussing the history of Islam in Brazil. Brother Habeeb is a British-born writer and historian of Nigerian descent. He is the author of 5 published books on race, erotic Muslim literature, and Afro-Brazilian history, and he is currently working on producing a documentary about being black and Muslim in Brazil. Brother Habeeb, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Karim. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, man. I'm having my coffee.
Alhamdulillah.
And by the way, some of my favorite beans on earth are from Brazil, so it's a real good connection we got going here.
MashaAllah.
Have you had Brazilian coffee beans before?
No, I haven't actually. I've heard much about it, but I'm not really much of a coffee drinker. I'm more of a hot chocolate drinker, to be honest.
MashaAllah, man. Well, what's interesting is where I live, when you go to these nice free trade coffee shops and they've got all these brilliant beans from all over South America, which is, I'd say, my favorite region of coffee. And when they get these Brazilian ones in season, I'm like, man, this stuff is amazing. And then when I've been to Brazil myself, and when I went there, I was like, where's all that good coffee that I was having back in the States? It's not as common, I think, with the everyday people. And I'm like, well, you guys all ship your good stuff outside and leave the regular okay stuff in the country, which was a little disappointing. But mashallah.
MashaAllah.
MashaAllah. So, Brother Habeeb, this is a very interesting documentary that you're working on, and an interest, and I know that you are very involved in historical, African history, Muslim history. So why don't you start us off by what inspired you to do this documentary on the history of Islam in Brazil?
It's following on from my book Illuminating the Blacks and African Muslims in Brazil, which explores Brazil's race relation in the history, and also the country's African Muslim heritage. And being, obviously, like you mentioned earlier, British-born Muslim of Nigerian descent, I was initially informed about the history of Muslims, especially Nigerian Muslims in Brazil, when I went to a Saturday school between the ages of 10 and 11. It was a Pan-Africanist Saturday school run by non-Muslims, and they were teaching us the history of black people in history and what they've contributed. And they also mentioned the history of Yoruba Muslims, and the Yoruba is a tribe in Nigeria, which I'm from. And that sparked my curiosity, because I was thinking, wow, there's Muslims in Brazil dating back to the 19th century, and they led a number of slave revolts. They were very strong in their faith, and they tried to preserve their religion by teaching people about Islam. They set up private Quranic schools, and that, for me, that was just like amazing. Like, these were enslaved Muslims, but still, yet despite that, they still tried to not only preserve their faith but also teach other people about the religion of Islam. So from a very young age, I was aware about the history of, like I said, the Muslims in Brazil. And later on in life, when I read a couple of other books and I went to Brazil for the first time in 2014, I thought it might be interesting to not only let people know about the contributions that Muslims have made in Brazilian history, but also for people outside of Brazil to kind of know about it, because not many people are aware about this great history that Muslims have made in Brazil and the impact that they've had on society.
Right. Now, from your research, so I heard you say that there's the Yoruba tribe of Nigeria, which are majority Muslim, and they had a presence in Brazil through the slave trade. Is that correct? And what were some other countries that the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch brought slaves to Brazil from in Africa?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade in terms of Brazil, majority of the Africans that were enslaved were transported from modern-day Nigeria, Benin, and Angola, because of the Portuguese. They used to, obviously they colonized Angola. They also, what many people aren't aware of, they colonized Nigeria before the British.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
wow.
That's why even like our former capital city, Lagos, is a Portuguese name. It's not and that's some of the connection. So a number of the enslaved Africans that were transported between the 16th and 19th century, a number of them were from West Africa. Especially the last 100 years, the last century of slavery in Brazil, 30% of the enslaved West Africans were Muslims, and a number of those were from the Yoruba tribe, and some were from the Hausa tribe. And that's why a large population of the enslaved Africans were Muslims.
So what percentage are some historians estimating as far as the slaves that were brought to Brazil were actually Muslim?
30%.
Wow, 30%.
Yeah.
And do you have any idea what the stats are for North America? Because I've heard similar numbers for North America as well.
For North America, I've heard in between 10 to like 30 as well. But again, it depends on what period, because what you had was in the first couple of 100 years of slavery, so between like the 15th and mid 17th or late 16th century. A number of the enslaved Africans were coming from Central Africa, and then towards the end of slavery, the last couple of 100 years, that's when a number of the Europeans were enslaving people from West Africa, from the Bight of Benin, which is modern day Nigeria and Benin. So when you're looking at West Africa, most of those Africans would have been Muslims. Whereas if obviously when they were enslaving Africans that were coming from Central Africa, a number of those Africans were not Muslims. So it depends what period you're looking at.
Got it. Okay, so about 30% of the African slaves brought to Brazil were Muslim, and the majority of those Muslims were coming from Nigeria, Angola, and what was the third place?
No, majority of those Muslims were coming from Nigeria and Benin.
Benin, okay. And Angola, they weren't Muslim there, or they also had a Muslim population?
No, Angola, they weren't Muslim. There's a very small Muslim population in Angola. Majority of the Muslims came from Nigeria and Benin.
Got it. Okay. So walk us through here from your research and even maybe what your documentary is trying to put together. So where does it start? So it gives us, first of all, this realization and this historical reality that we had about 30% who came were Muslim. So when these Muslims arrived to Brazil, what are some of the early documentations of stories or narratives of these early Muslims? How did they assimilate? How did they preach Islam? How did they maintain their identity?
Okay, I'll discuss that, but the actual documentary starts in the 14th century, because not many people are aware of that. The first Muslims to arrive in Brazil was actually in the 14th century from Mali. I'm sure you're aware of Mansa Musa. Everyone's aware of Mansa Musa, the famous Mali emperor.
Yes, but hold on a second. I want you to give us a quick summary of who he is for those that don't know. So Mansa Musa was a great king of the kingdom of Western Africa, specifically localized in Mali, correct?
That's correct. And his famous pilgrimage when he traveled from Mali to Mecca, he was known to be very generous, and he gave away lots of gold, so much so that he you could say that he affected the economy in Cairo, because the amount of gold that he gave to the local people, it greatly affected the economy. So that's why, I mean, his story is known not only, like I said, in Africa, but also in Europe as well. So much so there was a famous painting that showed a painting of him holding the gold nugget, and this was seen as one of the reasons why the Europeans invaded parts of like West Africa, because they were known to have a lot of wealth and opulence. But Mansa Musa, obviously I'm sure a lot of people know who he is, but his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, there's many reports from historians that he actually traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in Brazil in 1312.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, and landed in 1312 in a city now called Recife in northeastern Brazil. So in terms of my documentary, it wouldn't actually start in terms of looking at the enslaved African Muslims. It will start by looking at the travels of Abu Bakr II, who is the predecessor of Mansa Musa. We don't know much about Abu Bakr II's life other than the report which Mansa Musa gave to a number of Egyptian historians when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca about his predecessor who left, who wanted to understand, who wanted to know if there was another land past the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why he took a number of ships along with a number of his comrades. And there's some reports that he landed in Recife, and even a number of the Portuguese, when they arrived in Brazil about 100 years later, they found some gold spears that were from West Africa, which is one of the reasons why a number of historians are of the opinion that Mansa Musa and other West Africans did actually arrive in Brazil before the Portuguese colonizers in 1500.
Subhanallah.
Yeah.
So was it 1500s or 1352? I think you said earlier.
So Abu Bakr II landed in 1312, but Portuguese landed in Brazil in 1500.
Right. And I don't know if you're familiar with an author named Leonard Weiner. I think, again, this is my memory's fuzzy, but when I was taking some history courses back in the day, this book surfaced when I was in university, and it actually discussed similar points that you're making about how West Africans were crossing over to the Americas, both the North and South, obviously way before the Europeans. And that Leonard Weiner, in his book, he actually discussed how there were also gold coins with Arabic written on it found as early as the 10th century, dating back to the 10th century. So Allah knows best, but have you ever come across anything like that where it was even earlier than 1312?
Yes, I actually came across his book, and I made reference to it in my book. It was a 3-volume book. It was called African Discovery of America. And there was also another professor called Ivan van Sertima who followed up from Leo Weiner's book and talking about like the relics, some of the relics and the manuscripts they found of Muslims or Arabic-speaking people in the Americas. Now, I'm not going to say that, which some people say that like Africans or Muslims discovered Brazil, because I think that's inaccurate, because there's some reports that there were even some Europeans who traveled to Americas even before the Portuguese. So that's something that I think also the term discovered is problematic because there was natives living in Brazil. So it's not for anyone to say that such and such person discovered the country, but we can say that definitely there were some Muslims who traveled to like parts of Americas, whether South America, North America, before the Portuguese colonizers. That we definitely are aware of.
Right. Well, I'm so glad you know of that book, Leonard Weiner. So wasn't he from Harvard originally?
Yeah, Harvard University. He was a historian and linguist.
Okay, great. I'm glad you validated me because my memory serves correct.
Yeah, very good book. It's a very good book. It's a 3-volume book, and it's fascinating reading. That's something, again, as we as Muslims, I think that's part of our history and something which non-Muslims are saying this as well. But again, for some reason, many Muslims aren't aware of this, and it's part of our history, which I think is definitely a book that I would definitely recommend people to read.
Excellent. And I love how you qualify this idea of, it's not like anybody discovered North and South America. They already existed. And in fact, the natives of North and South America could say the same thing about us, the people who came over. Like, well, we discovered that you existed once you came over here too, right? So it's almost like everybody existed, and we just learned and started to come to know one another for the first time, perhaps, is a more accurate way to place this idea.
Exactly.
And you know what else, just another side note, I mean, I remember I had a friend in university who was from Haiti, and he used to show me pictures of his family. He was a convert to Islam, yet his name was Hatim. Like, I was like, oh, is that your convert name? He's like, no, that was my given name by my parents. But, my parents are from Haiti. I said, that's interesting. He said, yeah, man, I really think Muslims were in Haiti from way back when. And he showed me a picture of family gatherings, and the dress that they had, Brother Habeeb, was just like Nigerian clothing.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, there was in Haiti, Cuba, and even in Jamaica, there was a Muslim presence, like going back to like the 18th, 17th, and definitely the 19th century. So I wouldn't be surprised even if his parents were non-Muslims, maybe his parents' parents or parents' parents were Muslims. So that's not something which is surprising.
Let's take us to 1312 when Abu Bakr, you said the ruler Abu Bakr was crossing over.
Yeah, so Abu Bakr II landed in Recife, northeastern Brazil, approximately in 1312. We don't have much information in terms of the people that he settled with, what they did in Brazil, other than there were some manuscripts and some coins and a spear, allegedly from West Africa, which indicate that that's where he landed. But in terms of after, like you could say, 1312, we know about obviously the Muslims that, like I mentioned earlier, the estimated 30% of African Muslims that were transported to Brazil, predominantly in the 18th century, from the Bight of Benin. Now, a number of these Muslims that were enslaved, they were educators and they were also prisoners of war, because there were a number of wars in the Oyo Kingdom, which is in West Africa, in modern-day Nigeria. So a number of these enslaved West Africans that were Muslims that were transported to Brazil, they were educators and well-known in terms of understanding the religion of Islam, but they're also warriors as well, which is going to be important, which I'll speak about a bit later, when they led a number of slave revolts. Now, a number of these West Africans, once they arrived in Brazil, even a number of the European commentators, like you had in 1856, there was the representative of France in Brazil. He stayed in Brazil for about 18 months. He had mentioned that there was a type of black people amongst the black people that were different to the others, and he was referring to the Muslims. He said that they were very literate, they were educated, they were very proud of some of like their customs in terms of how they used to pray, and he even speculated that they might have not even been actually black people. He speculated that they might be Arabs, because the way they conducted themselves with such dignity, and again, like I said, they were literate and they kept themselves aloof from the other Africans who weren't Muslims. So that's why, and that's something that he mentioned in a couple of his letters in France. And also what he did mention is that a number of those Muslims, they bought Qurans, and there was a report that they bought over 100 Qurans in 1 year. And this is something that, I mean, subhanAllah, this is amazing. In the 19th century, despite that they were enslaved, and they were able, because in terms of understanding slavery in Brazil, it was quite different to how slavery was conducted in America. And what I mean by that was that although, yes, slavery was very harsh in Brazil, a number of the enslaved Africans were able to work on the side and in addition to their duties, like fulfilling their duties to their master, was able to work on the side and also buy their freedom, or just work on the side to kind of build a bit of money. Sorry, to save a bit of money. And a number of these Muslims, they saved enough money to buy Qurans and to teach people. And like I mentioned a bit earlier, they built some private Quranic schools, and they taught not only Muslims but non-Muslims about Islam and taught them Arabic, which again, this is amazing. And there's manuscripts which are available today, which is held in a number of libraries in Brazil, where you can see the like text, like where they're writing verse of the Qurans and du'as, asking for forgiveness, seeking forgiveness from Allah, and making du'a for all the Muslims.
Wow. So these are manuscripts found in libraries, or are there any found in museums? And if so, where could these potentially be found if one was to scope it out?
There's a library, Afro-Brazil Museum in Sao Paulo. They've got a number of manuscripts which I was fortunate enough to see for myself. And there's also a couple of manuscripts held in a library/museum in Salvador. It's called the African something museum, but it's still preserved today. And they've also they put it on screen, so obviously not everyone can touch it. So it's in special compartments where you have to go with, the same way like in Europe or America. It's not easily available to anyone, but they've taken photographs of it, and you can actually kind of see it, and you can read the Arabic scripts where they're writing verse from the Quran, and du'as and things like that. And it's just remarkable, and that's something that's going back since the 19th century.
Subhanallah, that's amazing. So these are some manuscripts that you've seen yourself, and I guess it was readable for you. You could actually make it out and recognize very clearly, like, oh, I know exactly what this is saying.
Yes, and that's something that hopefully, inshallah, is going to be featured in my documentary. And I did make reference to it and showed some of the pictures in my book as well. And also what a number of these West African Muslims during the 19th century, what they did, they led a number of slave revolts. There was a number of slave revolts in Salvador, which was the former capital city of Brazil during the colonial period, which is in northeastern Brazil. They led a number of slave revolts between 1807 and 1835. There was about 6 slave revolts in total.
Wow.
And I mean, even just because, I mean, some people, because I just want to make sure people, because when I've told people about Salvador, they keep getting Salvador the city mixed up with I think there's a country called El Salvador, or there's like an American state, San Salvador. So yes, it's totally different. It's Salvador in Bahia I'm referring to, and it's the same city. Which do you remember the Michael Jackson video? They Don't Care About Us.
Vaguely, but keep going.
There was a video that Michael Jackson shot. I think it was in mid to late 90s. I think it was. It was called "They Don't Care About Us," and that was filmed in Salvador in Brazil, and he was wearing the T-shirt throughout the music video with the word Olodum, and Olodum is a Yoruba word from the Nigerian language for the Most High, and that is Olodum is a group. It's an Afro-Brazilian like carnival group where they teach people about black empowerment and things like that. And that group, which was set up in 1974, it was set up paying homage to the West African Muslims who led a number of slave revolts, which we're speaking about, who were known as the Malays. The Malays that's what the Muslims were referred to amongst the Portuguese and Brazilians in the 19th century.
The Malays, they were called.
The Malays, yeah, they were called the Malays.
And is Malays a Portuguese word?
Well, some historians are of the opinion that maybe it's from the word Mali, or it's from in the Yoruba language, Imale means to study. And because the Muslims were known to study, that's why there were some historians of the opinion that that's where that word comes from Imale, which is known as to study. And it's a word that in modern day Nigeria now, that's what people call the Muslims.
Got it. No, thank you for clarifying. So take us back to these 5 rebellions that happened in northeastern Brazil.
Yeah, so the 5 rebellions first one was in 1807. And then there was another one in 1809, and then another one, I think, 1814, and then 1835. These rebellions, they were mainly organized by either Yoruba Muslims or Hausa Muslims. Hausa is another ethnic group in modern-day Nigeria. And because a number of, like I mentioned earlier, a number of the Yoruba and as well as the Hausa Muslims were prisoners of war because there was a number of wars going on during that time in the Oyo Kingdom in southwest Nigeria, in modern-day southwest Nigeria. A number of those enslaved Africans, they were warriors, and obviously they were educated about Islam and things like that. So for them to be enslaved, especially to be enslaved by a non-Muslim, was seen as something quite
traumatizing, to say the least.
Very traumatizing, to say the least. And even when they were interrogated, there's some really fascinating passages where sometimes the police interrogators would say, "Why don't you give up your religion?" And they said, "Even if you gave me all the money in the world, I wouldn't give up my religion for the sake of like the wealth of this world and things like that." And there were people that even during that period, the Portuguese had a respect for the Muslims. And what we should remember as well is that the Portuguese, they were aware of Islam from the time of Andalus, when obviously we know the Muslims occupied or ruled Spain and modern-day Portugal. So they're aware of Muslims and the history that the Muslims have had. And they saw the Muslims as being somewhat troublesome. And that's why they wanted anyone who had any traces of Islamic, you could say, appearance or dress or manuscripts in Arabic, they wanted to kind of put a squash to it. And they deported a number of these Muslims, and they also exiled them. Some were executed, unfortunately. Some were tortured to the point where, unfortunately, some of them left the religion of Islam. But in terms of looking at actual slave revolts, those 5 slave revolts, unfortunately, a number of those slave revolts were put to an end before they really managed to kind of gain any momentum, because there was a number of informants within the Africans. So, like with many plots, it's generally someone is within the group, which kind of informs like the authorities what's going on. And that's why even the most famous slave revolt in 1835, it only lasted for about 36 hours. And originally they planned for the revolt to take place on the night of Laylatul Qadr, the night of the day that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because they saw this as a holy day, obviously from the Islam perspective, and they used this day as a day to hopefully, inshallah, to try and not necessarily overturn and like create an Islamic state, which some unfortunately some Western historians allude it was just in order to gain freedom.
So did they want to kind of have their own, liberty and their own like state or region exactly? I mean, what was the purpose of the rebellion besides obviously being free? Was it to establish their own autonomous state? And what was the nature of these rebellions? Are we talking, was it a military rebellion? Was it, through knowledge and marching? I mean, what does the documentation suggest?
The documentation suggests that it was definitely a military revolts, but it wasn't to establish like an Islamic state. It was mainly they were fighting against the oppression that they were receiving. And what was interesting about these rebellions, although most of the rebels were enslaved people, there was also a number of free Africans who also contributed to this rebellion because they were fighting for the other brothers, not only the brothers in faith, but the other brothers in humanity that were enslaved. And that was something that was really remarkable about this rebellion, because it was very similar to the rebellion which took place in the Muslim world in Iraq, the Zand rebellion in the 9th century, when a number of black Africans rebelled against the Iraqis who transgressed against them in terms of how they were treating them. So that's something that I think I'm glad you asked that, because to make that clear, because some commentators have said that they were trying to make an Islamic state and it was jihad, and in reality they were just fighting against the injustice that they were being put under. So it wasn't like they were trying to establish like Islamic state or anything like that. It's just that they were fighting for not only their freedom, but the freedom of the other brothers and sisters, not only those who are within the same faith as them, but just for fighting against slavery as a whole. And that's why even today, a number of Brazilians, especially Afro-Brazilians, have adopted and incorporated the spirit of the Malays, the West African Muslims, because they were fighting against injustice. They didn't look at them as if they're just fighting because it's a religious war or holy war. No, they were fighting against injustice. And that's why you find a number of Afro-Brazilian activists, hip-hop artists, they take from the Malays, they make reference to them a lot in a lot of their activism that they're doing now fighting against anti-black racism, because these were people that were fighting against injustice. And that's why I think it's something that we as Muslims should not only be proud of, but try and incorporate in our daily lives to draw inspiration from, which not many non-Muslims are doing.
I don't think it's even appropriate to call them rebels or that this was a rebellion. I mean, if anything, they were fighting for their God-given right to be free, right? And it's like, to the Portuguese, maybe they're rebels, right? But it's like, excuse me, you're the ones that stole these people from their homeland and now you're enslaving them. So it's not really, a negative thing that they were trying to get this liberation and be able to live as free human beings. What would you say about that?
To be honest, you are absolutely right. And that's something that I struggled with myself, was calling them rebels and saying it was revolt, as opposed to calling them what they were freedom fighters. So I think what you said is true. And I think even that's something that when you hear the word rebels or revolts, it does sound like it's just reactionary. And they can sound like they're the ones that are problematic, they're the ones that's causing trouble, when in reality, they're just fighting for their God-given right, like you mentioned, to be free, and they're fighting for their dignity. So yeah, maybe to call them freedom fighters, which is, I would say, a better suited word rather than rebel. So right. Yeah, I'm pleased that you said that.
Yeah, and even if it was, a religious drive or a religious cause, again, what's the problem with that? I mean, that's part of who they are. That's part of their consciousness, their identity. And again, it's not like the Portuguese brought all these people over and were like, okay, everyone can practice their religion. They Roman Catholicized the whole land. So they did the same exact thing that they may claim that some of these African Muslims were trying to do, which was establish a sovereign state and be able to freely practice their religion. The difference is they didn't have the equal amount of manpower and gunpower to make it happen as easily.
I agree, 100%. That's true. I agree. Good point. That's a good point.
Because I think oftentimes, especially in historical discussions, when we're coming from a Western perspective, it's like there's this automatic footing of like, what goes against the ones in power is automatically the wrong ones. But it's like, well, why are the people in power in the first place? Usually because of wrong actions. And this is something well known that, many European nations totally exploited and harnessed more resources than other nations. And some argue this is the reason why they were able to advance. It's not because they had any other magic secrets to the universe. They just had more gunpowder, more people, and enslaved more people and used those resources. So if you have more of all that, you're probably going to advance than the next guy, aren't you?
No, that's true. And that's something, I'm glad you said that, because that's something that we don't generally like, and I'm talking about we as Muslims, challenge that in the beginning. So these people that's reacting, why they're reacting, like you said, is looking at the people that are in power. How did they get that power? And it's generally, in most cases, they've exploited people. So it's not even. Now I'm glad you said that, because it's not even like that they are reacting just for the sake of reacting. It's that they're trying to get back what is rightfully theirs.
Exactly. It's like you're trying to get back a little bit of what's already been totally robbed from you, and inevitably an oppressive situation. I mean, now you're in this new land, you're disconnected from everything you know and everyone you knew, and now all of a sudden you're trying to make the best of it. So, subhanallah, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. But let me ask you this. During these rebellions, was there any contact or support from West African Muslims or otherwise?
No, not really. Other than the West Africans who were coming to Brazil, in terms of those that was enslaved, but there wasn't much contact in the sense of, because obviously the distance between traveling from West Africa to Brazil was like a journey which took approximately 3 months. So it's not like they could have any contact in terms of to get more arms or anything like that. The only thing that they did do was that when a number of slave ships were going back to West Africa to try and get more slaves, they just told them about what was going on. So they had some reinforcements in that respect, but not in terms of like arms or anything like that, unfortunately.
I see. Okay, so we had these 5 rebellions, and it seems like every time there was a wave throughout the early 1800s, it got struck down pretty quick.
That's correct.
So the last rebellion was in 1835, which you said lasted approximately 36 hours. It was meant to launch on Laylat al-Qadr. So what happened after that?
So basically what happened after that, I mean, the Brazilian authorities, they had enough of the Muslims, and they then led to, you could say, like, they started a propaganda campaign to warn other Brazilians, other obviously Portuguese Brazilians, about these troublesome Muslims, or Moors as they were referred to, or Malays. And then so you had some newspapers in articles written in Rio, where they spoke about, if you come across any Muslims, you have to interrogate them, arrest them. If anyone's found with anything with Arabic on it, or like someone's got a Muslim sounding name, they either get arrested, interrogated, or deported. And then you had a number of West African Muslims, who were deported back to West Africa. A number were enslaved. A few were unfortunately executed, and some were imprisoned as well. And so I mean, you just had a very anti-Islamic stance that the government took in during that period. And one thing which is remarkable for me, just looking at what happened after the aftermath of the actual revolt, was that it didn't stop those Muslims that were staying in Brazil. It didn't deter them from them still trying to practice their faith. But unfortunately, they had to do it in secrecy. And you had a number of reports. There was one famous report in the early 20th century, like I think it was 1911, where an elderly Muslim, he spoke about how the religion has died out in Bahia because a number of the Muslims had either been deported, or those that were still like living in Brazil, they had to kind of hide their faith so much that even their children wasn't aware that they were Muslims. And that's how the faith unfortunately died out towards the beginning of like the 20th century. Sorry. So that's quite unfortunate. But a number of those West African Muslims who were deported, many of them arrived in either Lagos or Benin, and they built a number of what in modern day Nigeria we call them Brazilian mosques, and they were mosques that were used in the Baroque architecture style, which is quite prevalent in the churches in Brazil. So you have a number of mosques that are still standing in Lagos today, that the architecture is very similar to like churches in Brazil, and they were built by a number of these Afro-Brazilian Muslims who arrived back in West Africa.
Subhanallah.
So that's part of the legacy. That's part of the legacy of these West African Muslims. And what I wanted to do, and hopefully this is what I try to do in the book, and hopefully what I try and do in the documentary. Yes, we're aware of that the unfortunate history in terms of that number of these Muslims were enslaved, but rather than dwelling on slavery itself and the persecution, that it was, for me, I want to stress the importance of their fight in terms of trying to preserve their religion. And you can look back on them and say that they had a very difficult life, when in reality, and say that they were unsuccessful in terms of their revolts. Whereas from a Muslim perspective, you're looking at it like, no, they preserved their religion. Most of them, inshallah, died as Muslims, so they were successful from an Islamic perspective. And it's something that we as Muslims can draw inspiration from, because they were a minority within a minority in Brazil, because we know obviously the minority were black people. Within that, the minority were black Muslims. But yet, despite that, they still preserved their faith. They still had their dignity, and they still was able to be a catalyst in order to inspire people for generations to come, like we're speaking about them now. And even if you look at the story of like Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, we don't look at Prophet Yusuf and say that he was a slave, but he was enslaved. But that was part of his story. Yeah, do you understand what I mean? So what I'm trying to say is, when we're in terms of us Muslims, when we're controlling the narrative, it's not to look back at these unfortunate parts of our history in terms of a form of pity, but it's to marvel at that. Yeah, despite that they were enslaved, despite that they were in these horrific conditions, they still maintained their faith. There's still some stories of one particular. There was West African Muslim called Alufa Rufino. He was enslaved, but he bought his freedom within about, I think, 6 years. Then he traveled back to West Africa. He would travel back to Sierra Leone to learn about Islam. Then he traveled back to Brazil to teach people about Islam. And I mentioned that in my book as well. But when I'm reading stories like that despite that he was enslaved, he bought his freedom. And not only did he say, okay, I want to go back to my country and live amongst the Muslims, he went back to Sierra Leone, and he was originally from Nigeria. So he went to like a neighboring country, learned about Islam, learned more about Islam, and then traveled back to Brazil to teach people about Islam. And this was in the 14th century.
Yeah. No, what you're bringing up is very important. And it reminds me, of course, about, the Muslim experience in Al-Andalus, and the fall of Granada, and how similarly, those Muslims who were remaining had to hide their Islam, and over time it eventually just dissolved because of similar tension and stress. You hear similar stories as you're sharing in Brazil, and I'm sure in other parts of Islamic history, and even today. I mean, we're seeing now there's probably more of a soft war on the Muslim community in some parts of the West. And you're seeing similar things where people are either trying to have more integrity and honor in teaching their tradition and maintaining their lifestyle, especially when it's not bringing any harm to anybody. But you're also seeing Muslims who are losing their identity and changing the narrative of Islam in order to appease the political environment and voice of the time.
Yes, and that's what I'm more worried about. Like you said, the soft war. We've gone from colonialism to ideological colonialism, and that's something that I don't think many Muslims are aware of, because we're trying to fit in. Unfortunately, some people are trying to sell the religion just to kind of appease those that are in power. When you look back in history, those people that we celebrate, those people that were great, they didn't compromise. And I think that's something that we as Muslims have been. But again, a lot of that comes from a lack of understanding of some of these people's histories, because if you're just looking at when we was great and when we was in power, you're not gonna be able to draw inspiration for the time that we're in now, because we're not in power, we are the minority. So that's why looking at people like the Muslims in early America, or the Muslims in South America, like in Brazil, what you can draw from it in terms of, for me, not only is a form of dawah to educate non-Muslims about the history that Islam has had in these particular countries, but it's also a source of inspiration. That's what I think for Muslims living in the West, because we are a minority. We're under this, like you said, this soft war and this ideological colonialism, but we still can overcome this because we've got other examples in history who's been in similar predicaments to what we've got. And that's why I think it's important that these types of stories are told and we can draw lessons from, rather than just looking at the great period of Islam and the so-called golden era of Islam, when we're just looking back nostalgically about how great we was, but they lived a very different life to what we're living now because they were in power. So that's why I think these types of stories is important for our collective history, as important as like the so-called golden era of Islam, which everyone's trying to get back to.
Brother Habeeb, so why don't you tell us more about how Islam is looking in Brazil today? Is there a revival of this historical awareness? Are there practicing Muslims in Brazil? Tell us more about what you've learned.
Yeah, I would definitely say there's a revival now of Islam amongst Brazilians. It initially started in the 1990s, where you had a number of economic migrants coming from North Africa, some from West Africa and some from the Middle East, traveling to Brazil. And you do have a number of, before I actually mention the revival about Islam, in addition to obviously like the West African Muslims, which I mentioned, which died out in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you had a number of Arabs from Syria and Lebanon who traveled to Brazil. who migrated to Brazil, majority of them were Christians, but there was some Muslims. So you did have and those Arab and Lebanese descendant Muslims have been in Brazil for over 100 years. So other than the Arab and the Syrian and Lebanese Muslims, in the 1990s, you had a number of, like I mentioned earlier, you had a number of economic migrant Muslims traveling to Brazil, and this has led to like a slow revival especially amongst Brazilians of African descent that I came across in Sao Paulo and in Salvador. According to the last census, there's about I think 35,000 Muslims, but other estimates say that there's about 1 million Muslims, but that's still a very low minority because Brazil, the population is about 200 million. Yeah, but what I would say, despite, I mean, I was fortunate enough to visit Salvador a couple of times, which is in northeastern Brazil, and also went to Sao Paulo and also went to Rio. And even when I spoke to a number of the Muslims there, and I visited some of the mosques, and they hopefully, inshallah, will be featured in my documentary. And I wanted to find out, what is it like to be a Muslim in Brazil? I mean, do you find it very difficult? Do you suffer from Islamophobia and things like that? And the overwhelming majority of people I spoke to, they said that they don't find, they didn't experience much Islamophobia, that Brazilians are very tolerant people. If anything, a lot of people are ignorant, that they didn't know about Islam because of the media and things like that. But there wasn't as much animosity as from what they've experienced or what they heard about the Muslim experience in America or Europe. So that was quite fascinating for me to hear that despite a very small minority, people are still very interested to hear about Islam. Don't get me wrong, there are some instances, unfortunately, of Islamophobia which does exist, but overwhelmingly, the people that I spoke to, Muslim women wearing a hijab, saying that they didn't feel any of this form of discrimination or anything like that wearing the hijab. It was just more a case of people were the fear of the unknown. But once they were able to explain what the religion is and maybe certain things that they can and can't do, people kind of genuinely respected like their lifestyles and things like that. And that's something hopefully that I want to kind of let people know, especially for Muslims to travel, because, you've got the perception that we know Brazil is a dangerous country, but not everywhere in Brazil is dangerous. But some people have this perception, even non-Muslims, that you can't travel to Brazil, or even as a Muslim, you definitely can't go because they're all Catholics, when in reality, even myself going and speaking to people that have been in Muslims, that Muslim women that wearing the hijab and things like that, they said they felt at ease. They felt at ease in Brazil than they did in some parts of Europe. Yeah. So that's something that I would definitely encourage people to try and learn about, not only the history when you go there, but try and learn a bit of Portuguese. That probably would help. But the Brazilian people that I came across, in terms of their interaction with Muslims, although they didn't know much about Muslims, it wasn't as difficult as maybe some parts of Europe is in terms of to practice Islam and things like that. But if anything, it's just a lot of ignorance. But when I just spoke to just general people, Brazilians, and I spoke to them about my book and the research that I'm doing, a lot of them were actually interested to hear about, there was Muslims in Brazil, and like, what was the Islamic presence? So that's why I think the onus is on us as Muslims to try and reach out and let people know about the history of Muslims in Brazil, and even the contributions that Muslims have made in modern day Brazil, because I think that's important.
So Brother Habeeb, I'm interested to know if you know more about this other subculture called Condom Bleh. I think it's also known as Macumba, or a Macumba is one practice that they have, and this is a subculture, sub-religious culture that in Brazil is known to have more of its African heritage in place. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about what this is all about, and does it have any connection to some of the early Africans that were brought to Brazil?
Yeah, so Condom Bleh is a religion based on traditional African beliefs. It's prevalent in Bahia, especially in Salvador, northeastern Brazil, and a lot of the traditions, those African traditions, come from the Yoruba tribe. So that's what I'm glad you actually asked me that, because if you were to ask a lot of the average Brazilian about the Yoruba, they will think of Condom Bleh, because a number of they even speak the Yoruba language.
Wow.
Even in
today.
Even in Brazil,
Until today.
Their prayers and things are in the Yoruba language, and even in Cuba as well, you've got another form of Condom Bleh, but it's a mixture of Catholicism, traditional African religions, and it's again, obviously from Islam perspective, it's a traditional, it's a pagan religion, but it's very prevalent, especially in a lot of the African descendant populated communities in South America and also in Central America. Now, the Condom Bleh, they all wear white, And there was also a number of historians. They also speculated whether the white dress did that come from the influence of the Muslims. But there's no evidence which suggests that is the case. I'm not going to say that is the case, but I met a fascinating woman, which is going to be featured in my documentary. She's a priestess of the Condom Bleh religion, and she mentioned the presence of the Muslims. That even the way the women wear their headdress, she said that's from the Muslims, with how the Muslim women used to cover their hijab. And I put a short clip out on YouTube, but she mentioned that, and she mentioned that the one of the words that they called for God, which I mentioned earlier, Olodumare. And another one she mentioned Allah, but she didn't know where it's from. And she wrote Arabic. She said she was taught this from a young age, and she wrote the word Allah in Arabic, but she said she wasn't sure where it was from. But she said she knew it was from the influence from the Muslims, but she wasn't able to connect the dots until she met a couple of Muslims in the mosque that I visited in Salvador. But I'm glad you asked me about the Condom Bleh, because a lot of Brazilians, they know about the Yoruba because of Condom Bleh. Because a lot of their religious rites come from the Yoruba traditional religion, but they don't know much about the Yoruba Muslims, and that's what I wanted to kind of explain and speak and enlighten them about. So I'm very glad that she asked me about that.
Yeah, and were there any other? Could you detect any other facets or values or beliefs or dances or anything that may be also connected to Islam and the African Muslims? I mean, the fact that she can say Allah, and from some of the Brazilians that I know, some of them even mentioned that their great-grandparents knew Arabic, and they never knew how they knew that, but they did. And so it sounds like this is all coming together.
Yeah, on Fridays, they have like a special ritual and a form of worship. And when I spoke to the lady and asked why Friday, she said that it maybe comes from the Muslim Jumu'ah. I haven't really explored the links between the Condom Bleh religion and Islam, but I think that will definitely be a fascinating study for someone to kind of take up on.
Right. And links are, links aren't always the same thing as it being the same thing. Like, just because there's links to Islam doesn't mean it's currently Islam. And I think a very simple example of this is, when you look at any prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to humanity, they came with that pure message of Tawheed. And then obviously by the time another prophet came, you may find a lot of remnants of that previous message still in place, but also a lot of other stuff has been mixed in, lost or edited out. And a simple example of this is, let's say, what happened between Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam and Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salam, right? They both came with the message of Tawheed, but by the time the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam came, a lot of what Isa alayhi salam preached in certain parts of Europe was no longer quite the same message, right? Even though it was linked to it. So something like Roman Catholicism came from a Semitic prophet, it came from Tawheed, but some of the things you find in Roman Catholicism today will connect to that, and a lot of it won't. So similarly, this could be the case with this group as well.
No, that's very true. That's very true.
Brother Habeeb Akande, once again, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. It's always nice to hear from you, and I love the work that you're doing, and I'm a huge supporter, and I will surely put up that link for your website for the documentary release, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you tawfiq.
Barakallahu feek, and I love the work you're doing, brother. Just keep it up. That's the only thing I would say. Barakallahu feek, and keep it up.
Akramakum Allah, Sidi. Akramakum Allah. And inshallah, we'll be in touch for hopefully some more future shows.
Bidnillah, bidnillah.
Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel and growth. Don't forget to visit coffeewithkareem.com to see the latest news and updates about this podcast. Please generously help sponsor the show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.